I was born in Vienna on the 15th of January 1923. After the First World War, Austria was divided into the countries that were or became Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Romania. So in effect, my parents were Austrians, but they came, my mother from Slovakia, my father from Romania. But because it was the Austrian Empire, at that time, everything was Austrian. My mother came from Slovakia to study in Vienna. My father came from Romania to study in Vienna. And then they lived there for the rest of their, well, dare I say, not their lives, until Hitler came. I went to the normal school, not Jewish schools. I went to a normal primary school, and then a gymnasium, which is the equivalent of high school in this country. We lived closer to Slovakia, right at the edge of the city. It was called the working class district, because the working class district, you have a feeling it's dirty, factories, etc., etc. It wasn't nothing at all. A very pleasant district, parks, lots of greenery, beautiful buildings. My parents had a small or medium-sized store, clothing store, highly respected because, mentioned it because it was a working class district. There were people who couldn't afford the amount of money. So it was, I think it's called tick, you know. In other words, they bought and paid off. And my father never discriminated between a wealthy customer and the one that walked through the door and paid once a month a certain amount of money. And they were therefore highly respected people. And never any difference made between the customers, and very much of a Catholic country, of the really Catholic customers or the Jewish customer. Family in Vienna was not very large, because my mother came to live with an aunt when she was studying, who had 3 sons. One of them went to marry, 2 of them in Vienna. And so that was the family, plus 1 sister that my mother had. The others were still in Slovakia, and on my father's side in Romania. So the family was mainly quite diversified until the age of 14. And I told my parents I didn't want to go to university. I joined the commercial college in the center of Vienna. It was earlier in the early 30s. There was trouble in Vienna between, again, the working class and the upper classes. And because we lived across the Danube, I always remember my father being told by the police, who were very friendly to Daddy, to say, close the store up and stay indoors because there's going to be trouble. And for 2 days we were in the flat all the time, where shooting was going on from one side of the Danube across to the Danube. People were killed, and eventually after 2 days my father went downstairs and the police said, yes, you can open up, but there are casualties. So there was an undercurrent already, which eventually, I assume, looking back, was already a sort of fascist area becoming into Vienna. This became obvious on the day Hitler walked into Vienna, because the Viennese, some of them claimed that they were invaded. They were not invaded. I mean, I remember that distinctly, because by that time I'm 15 years old, and Hitler marches in and the flags were flying and the people were cheering and they're throwing flowers to the soldiers. It changed almost the day after the Anschluss, really. And we were very lucky because of where we lived, because it was, as I say, the working class district. At first, I carried on going to the college, and my father carried on with the business, my parents. But in the center of Vienna, almost within a couple of days, the swastikas started appearing, and the people were being, occasionally people were beaten up in the street, people started disappearing. What they did, almost the very first thing the Germans did, or the Nazis did, put it like this, was to close all the bank accounts belonging to the Jewish people. All the bank accounts. I found out only later that I had a small post office account, and even that was taken away. It closed inasmuch as we had no authority to take anything out anymore. So what they did, whether they left it there or whether they immediately emptied out, we just don't know. All we know, we didn't have it anymore. So you lived on what you had. But as I said, because the store was well stocked, my father carried on. Well, the first thing was, as far as I personally, or we were concerned, is until May, it was, when I say it's almost normal, that's probably the wrong thing to say, but it was, because as I said, I carried on to travel into center Vienna to go to the college. Daddy carried on. But on this day in May, whatever date it is, I can't remember, I came home and found my father had been arrested and taken away. And that same day, all the men and all the teenage boys from our district were taken away. And it took us, I'm not quite sure how, several weeks until we found out they had been taken to Dachau concentration camp in Germany. So my father was there. My mother was told to carry on the business. But what they did, they put in a young Nazi officer in charge of their stores. In other words, he took the money and my mother worked, which she was happy to do, except she was an employee, because anything that came in financially was handed over to them. They did give us some money because they had to live. I stopped going to college immediately because, first of all, because it wasn't allowed, and it wouldn't have been possible financially anyway. For me then to compare that time in my life, I wasn't informed of some of the things that maybe nowadays I would have done, because we were still slightly protected. The adults said, well, the children have to know. They don't have to know everything that goes on. So I can only tell you from my experience. All I know that it was hard because, first of all, I had to stop schooling. Then we were told, this is the Jewish elders, if I put it like that. We can't let them not go to school. We've got to do something about their education. The best thing for them to learn a trade, because the trade would come in handy, whatever. And so, there was dressmaking courses, there were some other sort of technical courses some of the boys went to. I went down to, there was a Jewish lady who started a dressmaking school. I went to that. I actually did a small Montessori course, Montessori being kindergarten. What is also got to be understood, there was a vast difference of how they behaved before the war, i.e. there were concentration camps, but weren't death camps. When I say there weren't death camps, the people still died in droves because they didn't get anything to eat. They worked like, but it wasn't at Auschwitz, it wasn't at Belsen. So there were certain things that we lived under, which was, if you want to call it a freedom, but it wasn't a freedom, because when you got up in the morning, you didn't know what the day was going to bring. And they made people come out of their homes, get on their hands and knees and start scrubbing the pavements. Jewish people, obviously. And it didn't make any difference whether you were my age, 15, or whether you're 70, 50, because you just were asked to do it. And while you're down on your hands and knees scrubbing away whatever, you know, people walk by, and some of them are people you had known all your lives, and suddenly they didn't know you anymore. Partly maybe they were scared that if they showed that they had an interest in you as a person, they would be looked down on as far as from the Nazis were concerned, or partly because they just didn't want to know you anymore, you know. When I lived here already, and, you know, I was completely grown up, I had nightmares. They weren't bad nightmares, but they were dreams that took me back. And I must have been about a whole year when we were married, that I used to evidently wake up whimpering and crying, and Dennis used to sort of, you know, hug me and say, it's all right, it's all right. That took a long time to get out of your system. It's never away, it's never gone. It's still in my head all the time. It's there, it'll never go away. But it's not as hurtful, and I don't, it's very difficult to explain. So when you were a teenager, and you lived through it, and as I said, when you got up in the morning, what are they going to do today? So when you went out, and you had to go out, obviously you wanted to go out, you never sort of, you went from A to B. You wouldn't stop in the street and start chatting to a friend or a neighbor, because, you know, you just wouldn't. You just went there slowly, not too low, not too fast. And one of the things, for instance, I was coming home, and they took all the women and children in our district, and I'm talking about our district particularly, and they took us onto lorries, and they drove us to a factory, an empty factory, very late, and they said, clean the factory up. And then after you've cleaned it, we'll let you go home. And when I say clean, we didn't have the materials you have now. So we had buckets of cold water, newspaper, and some rags. But because my mother was brought up one of 7, and she had to work when she was a young woman at home, she was quite happy to clean. And she showed me how to clean windows, for instance, with newspaper, and it works. And my mother wasn't particularly Jewish looking, at least that's what the Nazis thought, because she was fair. And they said to her, you know, it's your fault. You needn't have to be here. You married a Jew. And they wouldn't believe her. And they said, you can go home. And I'm not going home without my daughter, you know. And so we were there all day and cleaned, and then they let us go home. But I mean, there was never any rhyme or reason just because you were Jewish. So we got either a postcard type. When it was a letter, it was, of course, it would have been heavily censored. So all it said simply is, I'm all right, I hope you are, I love you, and I hope we'll see each other again. So that was the gist of the letter. There was nothing else in it. But at least we knew he was alive. So when I say these things happen, but as I said, apart from the fact that some people shunned you and some people just didn't want to know, some of them were afraid to have any contact with the Jew. Anyway, my mother carried on working. This SS man, I mean, he let her get on with it. He probably wasn't too bad a human being, because this went on until the famous Kristallnacht in November. I was doing all sorts of little things like the dressmaking, and I also actually, because I had English at school for about 2 years in the college, it was assumed that I could speak English, which I thought I could until I came here and I realized, you know. But yes, I knew a little bit, and somebody approached me and said, could I teach you their little boy? And I did, as best as I could, and they sort of paid me a little bit of money, so I don't know, whatever, 50p, equivalent 50p a pound or something like this, which I sort of put away. On Kristallnacht, on the day off, I was coming home from one of those classes I attended to, and halfway home I met this young SS officer from our store. And this is what I'm saying. Possibly he was quite a nice human being, because he stopped me and said, "Don't go home." And he wouldn't tell me why, although I asked him a couple of times and he wouldn't tell me why. But of course I did go home, because at 15 years old, my mother was there. Where would I go? So I did go home, and I noticed the store was closed. I went up to the flat, and the door opened to me with this high-ranking officer, and found out who I was. And so he took my mother and me, and he took us to our local synagogue. Now this Kristallnacht, it appears it was, the excuse was that one high-ranking officer had been assassinated. I think it was Heinrich or one of those. And in reprisals, they went to, this is in Germany as well as in Austria, they burnt the synagogues, they absolutely, sort of smashed the synagogues up. They burned places. There was only one little synagogue in Vienna, I was told later on, which they couldn't touch because it was in the middle of some very beautiful old houses, which was in danger of being damaged. But everything else, so they took us to the synagogue, our little local synagogue, which had indeed been smashed up on the inside, these sort of holy places, but the sort of pews were there, and there were all the women and children from our district, because the men weren't there anyway. And that I remember as harrowing, because I always remember that one lady who was screaming in pain, and they had dragged her out of her sick bed and brought her there. And we didn't know what was going to go on, because this high-ranking man with a gun walked around and he ordered people to sit, to stand, whatever he chose to do. And we were terrified. We were terrified. We were there all day, all night. Next day, there's a little episode comes into this, because they actually said to us they would give us some coffee, but they hadn't any coffee pots, and would anybody volunteer with coffee pots? Well, we didn't live very far away, so I put my hand up, and they sent me home with a guard, and I'm sure there was a dog there, I seem to remember the dog. And I went to the flat. I mean, what I was going to do at the age of 15, run away, well, And I packed my mother's shopping basket with a couple of coffee pots, which really wouldn't have gone very far anyway, but that's all we had. And unbeknown to me, my mother always lined her shopping basket with some little paper. When we got back into the synagogue, and Mummy told me afterwards that she nearly passed out, because what I didn't know, that underneath the paper she had managed to hide away some money, which they found, and it wasn't particularly pleasant. So then the day came to an end, and they said we could go home. And then we filed out, a dreary, very hungry and tired bunch of women and children. But when they got to me, or to Mummy and me, they stopped us and told us that the man in charge had seen the flat and he liked it and he wanted to live in it. So we could go back and pack a bag, and then we had to leave. And the store would be closed permanently. And I've been asked what we took, and I don't know. I can only assume there was some clothing and some food, maybe. And then we stood outside and wondered where to go, what to do. And my mother then remembered that a cousin of ours in the centre of Vienna had emigrated a little while beforehand, and the flat was empty. At least she was sure it was empty. Where she got the keys from, I don't remember, I don't know. When we moved in there, We took with us a couple of old ladies who were friends, and we didn't have anything except the little bit of money that I earned teaching English, which I found, so they bought us food for a couple of days. And then a large Jewish organization, which was international organization. So this is before the war, and it existed in Vienna. Think of Kultusgemeinde, you may have heard of it. They stepped in and they helped us then, obviously. We were allowed back in the flat to take some things out that they didn't want. Because the other thing really happened when they first came, this is going back to when the Nazis first came, they didn't just sort of took the money, etc. They then came into the homes and, I call it looting, took what they wanted. Because there were some very wealthy Jewish people, the aristocratic Jews, the Rothschilds, etc. of this world, the bankers, who had treasures. But they didn't just stop at the treasures. They came into our home, and we didn't have a lot of things, but my mother had a few little Dresden china. So they took whatever they took. But there were things they didn't want. So when all this happened with the Kristallnacht, I mean, my mother was allowed in at one occasion to take some linen out. I can't remember what it was. But there were a couple of things that happened at that time in November. The first thing was that the Nazis decreed they would let the Jews leave. Because prior to that, they didn't want us, but at the same time they didn't let us go. And so they said they would let us go, which was a marvelous piece of news, except where could the Jews go? Who wants the Jews? And it was a different world than it is now, because Britain, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all those countries had a very small quota system in those days, in hundreds. And that was full up because it was per year so many people. But then, funny enough, and for some reason, the Chinese decreed that the Jews could settle in Shanghai. You were allowed to leave, but you didn't know where to go. But the Chinese, as they came in with this thing. So my mother managed, again, how I do not know. The fact that the Chinese offered to let the Jews go, you still had to have some sort of working permit, actually, type thing. And my mother then, how to this day, I don't know who she managed to know. It was some sort of distant relation, a young man who was a doctor in Shanghai, and she managed to get hold of the address. Anyway, how she got hold, she did, and he sent the visa and they had it for them. But that was for my parents. Now, my father was in a concentration camp, so the visa was useless because he was in the camp. And in the center of Vienna, there was a big hotel called the Metropole, which was the Gestapo headquarters. And very early in the morning, the women used to queue up outside the headquarters in the hope to talk to somebody, to ask what was happening to their fathers, their sons, whoever. And one day I joined them, and because I was the youngest one there at 15, as they opened up at, had to be there about 6 o'clock, and they opened up at 8 o'clock, they took me in ahead of the queue, and I saw this man, and he wanted to know why I was there. And I explained about my dad being in the concentration camp, but the visa was there. And they're very efficient, the Germans. They had the list of all the prisoners. And he looked it up and he said, yeah, there's no reason. My father wasn't political or anything. Yes, he could be released. And but there was typhoid in the camps, and nobody was allowed in or out for the time being. So that was good news and bad news. And then the second thing was the British government, through the auspices of the Quakers and a Christian group called the Christadelphians, and of course Jewish groups, passed a bill that would allow children to come to Britain under the Kindertransport. It wasn't straightforward. You couldn't just go on a train and come to Britain. You had to have a sponsor or somebody who took you in this country. It's only recently, believe it or not, I found out that to this day, people don't know the full story of the Kindertransport. Because I had two friends here who have been old friends of ours, and we talked about what was happening today, and they said, you know, and I said, I must explain. How many people know that when the children came, each child was taken in by a family, etc. The family had to deposit £50 to the government so that the child would not be a burden on the government. Very much different sort of story what it is today. £50 equivalent about £2,000. So there was quite an undertaking, but the British people came up trumps, as they always do. And the amount of people that took the children in weren't just Jewish people. There were ministers, there were Catholics, there were Protestants, there were Quakers. There were people of all walks of life who took us in. 10,000 children. 10,000 children. Now, my mother insisted I should get onto this list. Prior to that, as I said, when all this happened, when everything was lost, to explain my parents, when they started building a business, they had nothing. Every penny they earned is what they earned. Nobody gave them anything, is what they earned. And with a stroke of the pen on the 9th or 10th of November, everything was lost, everything, my father in a camp. And there were occasions when my mother didn't want to live anymore, but she did get over it. But when this list came about the Kindertransport, and she wanted me to be on that list, I didn't want to go, because I felt, how could I leave her? But then this is just what I could not understand. To this day, I still don't know how these women did it, because they signed their children to go to an unknown country, to unknown people, and they didn't know whether they'd ever see their children again. In fact, out of the 10,000 you just mentioned, 60% of children never ever saw their parents again because they didn't survive. That's a lot of children without parents. 15th of March, 1939 is the day of my departure. There was two sisters who were allowed to emigrate to Israel. Oh, is it what Palestine is what? There was one went to, no, all three of them went to Palestine, I think, or Israel. There were two boys who one went to Britain, one went to America. But anyway, I didn't know anybody. All I know is that my mother, my suitcase is packed, the suitcase is still up in the loft. And I was taken to the station, and there were all the women, aunties and grandmas, because I don't remember men there at all, obviously, because there just weren't any men around, Jewish men. So they put us on the trains, and in those days the trains, if you remember, well, you don't remember, because you wouldn't, would you really? But Paul, if you remember, the trains used to have windows you could slide down. Remember that at all? Yeah. And so we were hanging out of the open windows, talking to mums and whatever at the platform, and they were talking to us, and then the train started to move. And I remember them, people waving with their hankies, and they were running alongside. And I still don't know how they did that. How did they have the courage to let us go? I spoke to one of my friends who lives in Glasgow, actually, and they came on Kindertransport as well. And it's only over the last sort of 2 or 3 years we started chatting about it again. And I said, did you feel it was a bit of an adventure? And they said, yes, it was, wasn't it? I mean, behind all the fear, there was just this, we're going somewhere. So the train left, and for a little while we wondered if they actually let us go. But they did. So the train was going through Germany into Holland. And it rolled into Holland, and this is a wonderful memory, because it stopped and the Dutch women came along and gave us buns and drinks to have, because nobody else did. And I think the essence of that feeling was the freedom. We didn't have to be afraid anymore. And that was an unbelievable feeling.
The Hook of
And
Holland.
the train went from there to Hook of Holland, from Hook of Holland over onto the ferry across the channel. Very long overnight journey, actually. I don't know what if it's still there. From Hook of Holland to Harwich, all overnight. And we had cabins, very nice, comfortable cabins, except we were all terribly seasick and not used to the channel. And then from Harwich to Liverpool Street Station. There we were met by people. Well, of course, it depended on, there were other people waiting for you, in my case. There were some children had to go to holding camps to be picked up. There were some children who actually went to hostels. There was a hostel in Glasgow, for instance, for boys. And the children, there was one at Dovercourt, evidently, where there was a holding camp where they had to wait. I was met by a young man who was going to take me up to Glasgow, because by that time I'm 16 years old, so the idea was that I would be an au pair to this family in Glasgow, and au pair, as we all know, is supposed to be, it allows you to do some studies as well as working, obviously helping in the home. I always remember the journey. It was a lovely journey, because even now the train up to Glasgow took hours longer. I mean, it's 4 hours now, it was something about 8 hours. It was a very long time. But it went all through the Lake District, etc. So a very pretty countryside, lovely countryside. And again, it was very strange, because I always mention this in my talks because it's perfectly true. There were still the little station signs, but I couldn't understand why so many stations were called Bovril. So, but we got up to Glasgow, and I was taken to this family. Well, that wasn't very nice anymore. My friends in Glasgow, very close ones, and one is still there, actually. Unfortunately, his wife, and it would have been married 74 years this year. She died last year, but her parents were very high class, business people in Germany. They were German, and he became a chauffeur and she became a housekeeper. It didn't matter what your profession were, because the fact that you were a doctor didn't mean you could be a doctor here, because you had to take new exams, etc., etc. So there was the majority of people that came over, the older people, were domestic servants or of some kind, In my case, because I say I was 16, I should have been allowed to have some schooling. It didn't work out like this, unfortunately. I was living in Glasgow, and then obviously I corresponded with my mother. My father came out in May, so that was just over a year that he had been. By that time they had moved him, as I said, to Buchenwald. He came out, and they managed to they managed to get some more stuff from the flat. And again, as I said, I have got some pictures. There's 2 of them hanging on the wall there, which belong to my parents. Because very, very, very quickly, just my mother's oldest brother, prior to the First World War, became a surgeon in Vienna. He was actually killed during the war as an army surgeon, but he had owned some lovely paintings that patients, etc., had given him. And so there were certain things the Nazis didn't want. And what they didn't want, so my parents thought that when they moved to Shanghai, they were going to live there for the rest of their lives. So they took with them as much as they could. They went from Vienna on the train to Italy, to, I don't know, and they went on a ship. I think the Lloyd Trestino, if I remember. They went to a ship which actually was quite comfortable for them because again, this is something very grey in my memory, that they had the money, but I can't remember where this came from to buy this passage. But they did have a passage to Shanghai, and I believe it was really quite a nice, comfortable passage. We were united in 1948, in autumn 1948, because I managed to get a visa for it. I became a British citizen, you see, and managed to get them over here, and in 1948. And by that time, because Shanghai, of course, the Japanese were in Shanghai as well, which didn't affect the Jews. There was a film on television only about a month or so ago about the Jews in Shanghai. It wasn't a piece of cake at all. They lived in very, very bad sort of, surroundings. And my mother said there was my father became a manager in a factory. That's one of his visas. My mother became a housekeeper, again in Shanghai. And when it was very hot in Shanghai, the district became a ghetto, actually, of the Jews. The relief they had, for instance, is sleeping on the roof at night because it was very hot and humid. They had no sort of facilities. They were wealthy Jews because there was a Jewish community in Shanghai, I believe, wealthy one, long before the war. So that were there. They both suffered. They both had some tropical diseases. And of course, once war broke out, I had no more contact with them except through the Red Cross every so often. Little notice. That was one of the big problems I've heard from other people who were lucky enough to be reunited with their parents. It was difficult for them to get used to the fact that I'm not 16 years old anymore. I was a grown woman, and it was probably more difficult for them to adjust. That it was, their love was there, but the adjustment took a little while. My parents, and believe it or not, this is honestly true, my mother wasn't a great sort of diamond person or anything like that, because she just loved, the life they had without all the trimmings, if you like. But every so often Daddy would buy some earrings. So she had, I think, a couple of pairs of earrings and a diamond brooch and a pendant and an engagement ring. Well, when the Nazis came and we realized what was happening, we had very good non-Jewish friends, and they very kindly hid some of the stuff away. Well, the story goes that after they had been on the ship for 2 days, all the trunks, because some people say that the Jews left with nothing, but I mean, they did have 2 trunks, as I understand, with bed linen, and some clothing and some cutlery and things. You know, things that you would do when you move sometimes. You know, not much, but you know. Well, these trunks had to go into the hold, and Daddy said he wanted to go in the hold. He wouldn't tell my mother why. I'll tell you when I come back, he said. Well, when he came back, he presented her with a diamond brooch, a diamond pendant, and some earrings. And she asked, "How did you do that?" Well, he said he got it from the Vietnams, which were our friends. The Nazis, when you packed your bags or your trunks, before you closed them, they would examine to see that you weren't smuggling anything out. Well, Dad had sewn these bits of jewels very slightly into the cuff of his shirt. And when they said you can close your trunk, he pulled this and hoped it had dropped into the trunk, which it did. In 1948, well, I was I left the people. Prior to that, I changed homes about 3 times because I was very badly treated, the people who took me in. And I then lived with a Kristallnacht family. That was before 1948, of course. And I lived with friends of mine in Holland Park because I moved from London, from Glasgow to London, and stayed with friends of mine. So I came from them down to London, and they said I must get a job, and there was a job advertised for. There was a large store in Kensington called Barker's of Kensington. You wouldn't know anything like this, but you might remember Barker's. And I went down. There was an office job, and I got the job offered to me. I was on a Friday. I got a job offered to me for the Monday morning if I wanted it. And the gentleman said to me, "It's not. You probably could do better, but that's all I can offer you." And I thought, great. Right? And I came out, and I had a cup of coffee, and I sat on the bus. This is quite clear. I sat on the bus going back home again, and I had the Kensington Post in front of me. And all I can say is, I've said this before, life is so much stranger than fiction. There was an advert for an advertising agency in the West End in Davis Street. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And I sat on the bus and I carried on got into Davis Street just after lunch. And saw the company secretary, and he interviewed me, and he said, yes, but he says, I can't give you a definite answer because I have to have a word with one of my other directors. And I explained about this job at Barker's, and I've got this job offered to me for Monday morning, what shall I do? And he promised to let me know, and at 5 o'clock that afternoon they offered me the job, and 37 years later, I spent all my career in advertising. I loved all of it except the last sort of few years when the Americans came in and advertising was no longer what it used to be, but it was a wonderful career and I loved every bit of it. So I carried on and I worked, and as I said, one of the best things in my entire life happened to me in 1956 when I met a young man, a young Englishman, and in 1957 we got married, and for 47 years he wasn't Jewish, and they had, I was so blessed, my goodness, I was blessed. Thank you for having me.